Hello, hello, hello. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. Very nice to see you. Been a little while. Ooh, have I done
Yeah, it's been eons. I basically want to play you Robin Swithinbank as the as a journalist who moderated making the waitlist last year in Orology Forum 2019. I wanted to play you certain parts, just a couple, and have some questions based on them, considering today's current climate. So, allons-y, let's go.
Mohammed, it's tempting to believe that waitlists are a modern phenomenon, and we find ourselves discussing them here at Dubai Watch Week for the first time. Have waiting lists always existed in your experience, or is this a modern phenomenon?
Good question.
Okay, so yeah, it was. So two questions to this. What do you, Robin, think triggered the concept of the allegedly modern phenomenon that is waitlists? And second question, part of that question is, do you see Corona/COVID triggering another phenomenon of this nature, be it a more extreme version of the waitlist or abolishing the waitlist altogether?
Good question. Well, I think in the first case, much as we discussed in that forum, if I remember rightly, social media has played a huge part in the evolution of the waitlist to a point where, as Mr. Siddiqui said on a number of occasions, some people will be waiting as long as, I think he said, 12 years, which is an extraordinary length of time to sit around and wait for a watch. I think he also said that, of course, that some people may never actually get their watch, depending on whether or not they decide to invest in other pieces in the meantime. So I think he referenced one guy who had been waiting for a Nautilus, I think, for a couple of years. And in between times, he hadn't bought anything else from Siddiqui. And therefore, he was not considered eligible, shall we say, for a Nautilus. And I think, let's take that guy as an example. So he's fallen in love with a Nautilus, and that is, it's his heart's desire, if you like. Now, 15 years ago, would he have been quite so obsessed with one watch? I think probably not. Obviously, we can't be entirely certain. But I suspect that his obsession with that one watch has come about as a result of extensive research, by following influential people in the watch space, and by becoming more educated. But equally, a consequence of education, I suppose, is that you become more obsessed with something. You can go down the rabbit hole. And social media is the rabbit hole for many watch collectors or would-be watch collectors. That's often where the obsession starts. So I think Instagram in particular, the visual medium, has played probably the biggest part in the sort of rabid, aggressive manifestation of the waitlist. I think in answer to your second question, which of course is...
No, but you didn't answer. You didn't answer the what. So I mean, or do you mean to say that the triggering of the alleged phenomenon of the modern of a waitlist in general, this modern as being a modern phenomenon, are you saying it's the want to learn that you something? Actually, yeah, you didn't answer, because something must have triggered the person to have to learn more, be more loyal, and so on. So what triggered? What is the trigger to making this, for this modern phenomenon of the waitlist?
Well, it has to start somewhere, doesn't it? And we're very visually stimulated, particularly men, as we all know. And I think, largely speaking, those who are queuing up to buy Pepsis and 5 7-Elevens and so on, they're largely speaking men. And I think, I don't want to go back to my point, but I think that, you know, if you sign up to Instagram in 2010 or something like that, and you start getting sent in the direction of male interests, if the algorithms pick up that you're a guy in 30, 40, 50 years old, then it starts sending you links to, or start sending you profiles which are featuring cars and watches and beautiful ladies and so on and so forth. And I suspect for a lot of people that the interest did develop from just seeing watches pop into their feeds where perhaps they may not have had an interest before. Now, obviously, that's far from exclusive. We can't blame that alone. I mean, it used to be that for men, it was what you swap stories about in the pub. Pub being a very English word, of course. So you'd go down to the pub and you talk about football, and then if you had a nice watch on your wrist or a nice car parked outside, then that's one of the next things you talk about. Instagram has simply given that a global and very visual form. So it's about conversation. It's about the stuff you talk about with your mates, and if your mates are into watches, then you start learning about watches, and then as I say, down the rabbit hole you go. And I think you then, in this day and age, and to use the context of the modern phenomenon, you then start looking at social media, because that's where the vast amount of content is these days, and it's incredibly consumable, and your interest and your understanding can grow very, very quickly. But I suppose before all of that, maybe if we think about it slightly more philosophically, it's about desire, it's about lust, it's about wanting what someone else has and perhaps what you can't have. And in the case of watches on the wait list, often the watch is a piece that you can't have, or at least you can't have it now, and that fuels your desire. So often we want what we can't have, and I suspect that it's a virtuous or a vicious circle, depending on which way you look at it. If you're a retailer, I think you think it's a very virtuous circle. If you're somebody who just wants one watch and you can't get hold of it, it's probably a vicious circle. But yeah, I think it's sort of embedded deep within the psyche that we want the most beautiful things, and we want things that are difficult to get hold of, partly to satisfy our own lust and desires, but also, something rather priapic about it as well. We want to be able to show off and say, I have reached a level of sophistication and wealth and status that enables me to not only purchase this watch, but actually procure it, to be at the front of the queue, to make the top of the wait list. There is a certain bullish feeling, I suspect, that comes of reaching the top of the wait list and being told, when the big finger in the sky comes out and points at you and says, it's you are the one who is going to get the watch. It's not happened to me. I've never been on a wait list, but I can imagine that for a lot of people, that's how it feels.
Because you've never needed to be on a wait list, Robin.
I'll come now, Don.
And what about the second part? How do you see COVID-19? How do you see COVID-19 impacting that wait list, the triggering of that wait list today?
This is really fascinating. I mean, I think there are two ways of looking at this, and one reflects heavily on that psyche that we've just discussed, and the other probably more on the way the economy is going to shape up over the next few years. Let's get the negative out of the way first. I mean, the economy is going to be hit extremely badly by COVID. We've had 3 months really where there's been considerably lower productivity than we've seen at any point in modern history. And as a consequence of that, there's going to be less money sloshing around. So it may well be that the watch industry suffers a little bit. We obviously know that in the short term it suffered because there have been very few exports. Exports have fallen off a cliff. And of course, retailers haven't been able to sell watches. So there's a short-term hit. Now, whether that becomes a long-term hit, we don't yet know. But I suspect that at the lower end of the market, the hits will be longer lasting, because those who are in the aspirational category, and we can determine what that is in dollar terms, probably according to where we live and what our own perceptions of aspiration are, but certainly in that sort of below 2,000 Swiss franc export, let's say, I should think the industry will be hit really quite hard, because it's those who are in that kind of squeezed middle space who might find their budgets have to tighten, and therefore there's less money for that special occasion watch or that collector's item that you've been hanging around or you've been saving for 5 years. Suddenly, in a world where cash is king and you might lose your job next week, then the chances are you're going to be a little bit more conservative in your purchasing decisions. The flip side of that, and the positive as far as the industry is concerned, is that this sort of lack of productivity and this lack of distribution over the last 3 months has actually made those unicorn watches, if we want to call them that, it's not a term I love, but those most desirable watches, the 10 or 15 pieces which make up those wait lists, Uh, Production numbers of those watches, of course, have gone down by circa 25%, let's say. So the Rolexes, the APs, the Pateks, who knows what some of the independents have been able to do over the last 3 or 4 months. But because of that, there are going to be fewer Nautiluses around in the near future. And at the same time, the very wealthiest, those who can afford these things, are not going to have been hit quite so hard in the short term. And I suspect that a combination, therefore, of lower production levels and unabated lust and relatively speaking, still high levels of wealth will mean that actually those wait lists are going to grow. And I mean, I'm in touch with a number of UK retailers and talking to them over the last few weeks, none of them have reported a drop-off in desire for these watches. There's been no drop-off in interest. There's been no drop-off in registrations. And if anything, therefore, because they haven't had the product to deliver, those wait lists are getting longer. So I think it's a double-edged sword, and I think those rare pieces made by those top-end brands that are most desirable at the moment, I think the demand for those will continue to surge for some time. But I suspect that if we look more broadly across the industry, there will be some significant dings to absorb. So I hope that answers your question, Don.
You did. So basically what you're saying is that you think that it'll be more extreme. You went on the side of that the wait lists now have become more extreme because of Corona, that it's now more grown. So therefore it's more intense.
What will be interesting to see is whether the number of watches on that, in that sort of, in that unicorn space, actually grows. And talking to a few retailers, it sounds as if desire for perhaps what models that we might have considered in the second tier in terms of popularity. So if we consider that, I don't know, Rolex, AP, Patek Philippe, FP Journe, Richard Mille are in a sort of a category all of their own, where pretty much every watch has a wait list on it. If you think about the sort of Omegas and the Breitlings and the Tag Heuers and other hugely popular brands which make some sort of mainstream pieces, but not necessarily in the same volumes that they've been able to traditionally, I wonder if some of those pieces may become a little bit more desirable, and we might see wait lists. So I think it's probably most likely to center around special editions, limited edition pieces. For example, one retailer told me that he has a wait list on the new James Bond watch, the new Omega, which will come out. Who knows when it's coming out now? But I'm sure that the commercial side of that piece will coincide with the launch of the film later on this year. So yeah, I think that's not right. Is it that watch is already out? I think people are already buying that watch. Anyway, that's not relevant. The point is there is a wait list against that watch. And then similarly, incredibly actually, and this really struck me when I was talking to one London retailer, they said they had a wait list against the Tag Heuer Connected, which is something that I wouldn't have predicted in a million years.
You mean the Tag Heuer, the digital version watch?
Yeah, the luxury smartwatch, which bodes well for that category, which is a category that I still can't quite get my head around. But you know, there's a market out there for this kind of product, and it sounds as if there are some people queuing up to get hold of them, which is a surprise to me, but yeah, it's now spoken, they say, around these parts.
Wow. Okay. Let me play you your second point.
And of course, increasingly, there are other means of getting hold of these watches. We've talked about flipping briefly. We've talked about the secondary market briefly. But the pre-owned market is growing at quite a pace at the moment. According to one analyst I spoke to last week, the pre-owned market is now worth $16 billion a year, which against the primary market of $50 billion a year suddenly becomes a very significant segment.
Okay. What do you think COVID has done to that balance you just mentioned of 16 billion per year of the, secondhand market versus the primary market, 50 billion per year? What do you think Corona has done to that balance now?
So if the pre-owned market was worth around 16 billion a year or two ago, according to that analyst that I cited during the panel, and the market was already on an upward trajectory, and then you added the pandemic and the fact that the distribution model was pretty much pandemic resistant. I reckon that the market this year could be worth certainly north of $20 billion, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's 25. Danny Govberg's estimation that the pre-owned market could be worth as much as the primary market by 2030. It could well be that that's actually by 2025 as a consequence of the pandemic, and then also the change in behavior that we're going to see in the consumer and among consumers over the course of, well, from now on, really. I think the new normal will dictate that consumers are much more likely to purchase watches online, luxury items online. We're already seeing it. Sotheby's started their weekly sales back in April or something, and within the first two weeks, they'd had record sales, the highest amount ever paid for a watch online, at auction, I should say. Sort of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think the second week they sold they sell a Nautilus or something for $480,000 or something like that. Extraordinary numbers against an online for an online sale of a pre-owned watch. And obviously that's a rare and very special watch, but I think if you apply that that basic formula right the way down, I think that we're going to see a massive spike in the pre-owned market as a consequence of all this.
Wow, so that's a good point what you said about the lifestyle changes because of Corona, because people are like, okay, yeah, it's over, but actually you're right, it's not over, essentially, in terms of our behavior. It will impact.
No, absolutely not. I mean, we've been moving steadily and slowly at a glacial pace, really, in the luxury industry and in the watch industry, to a point where we will buy anything online. And this has been for me, the final catalyst, the tipping point that moves us into a place where we are prepared to spend any amount of money on anything that we need online, whether it's a car, or, I mean, there are people buying houses at the moment online. So you do a virtual tour.
Virtual tours, right?
Yeah, you do a virtual tour. You like the look of it. You're not content to risk your life to go and actually see the place, even with gloves and masks on. And so you make your decision simply by what you see through your computer screen. So you're spending, millions of dollars potentially on something you've never actually physically seen, which is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. So why that wouldn't apply to a watch, I can't imagine. In fact, it's completely opposite. It will apply to a watch. There will be people all over the world who are spending vast amounts of money on pieces that they never actually handle. And that's this is the tipping point, no question.
So based on that, then the primary market better get with the program of, well, I mean, I read that Patek started producing again, right? So they better get started producing again, right?
Yeah, I mean, goodness, all the watch companies will be chomping at the bit to re-enliven their production schedules. Obviously, they've got to do it within the measures that the Swiss government have outlined. But I think what we're starting to see now is that brands are behaving slightly differently when it comes to pre-owned. MB&F being the latest example, in that I mean, it applies to new watches as well. If there's an MB&F watch out there somewhere, then and it's being retailed by, let's say, a retailer in Singapore, then MB&F will showcase it on MB&F's website, but to be sold by the retailer in Singapore. So there's a whole new dynamic there, which we're seeing for the first time. And it's always great to see the independents coming out with these innovative ways of joining all the dots. And I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see that much more broadly. It'll be a long time before the Rolexes and the Pateks of this world catch up and behave in a similar way. But we're going to see lots of new, dynamic, innovative ways in which brands are selling both new and pre-owned watches.
I love that you made that reference, because I just did this with Max, the MB&F, showcasing retailers on there, and he just mentioned that as well. So it's a nice parallel from your POV. It's so nice to see camaraderie emerging, and you're right, it's camaraderie. It seems to be a byproduct of the chaos in certain situations.
Let's face it, it's a fairly symbiotic industry in any case, as is any industry really. We all depend on one another to a point, and it's nice to be able to tell good news stories as a journalist. Sometimes media is often accused of only telling bad news stories. As the old Fleet Street editors used to say, everything in my newspaper has to either scare my readers or make them morally outraged. Sometimes it's nice to be in a position to tell good news stories and to encourage good behavior, ethical behavior, but also smart behavior. And this is clearly an example of a brand saying, right, here's a challenge. What are we going to do to overcome it? And coming up with what, at least on paper, looks like a smart solution.
Well, our journalists are our truth tellers. So when there's bad news to report, it's usually because bad behavior is going on. So
absolutely. Oh, no, I'm not dissing the practice of telling bad news, but sometimes it's nice to be able to share good news.
Thank you so much for your time. It was enlightening, and I hope that you are staying safe during this time with your family.
Thanks, Tom. Always a pleasure to talk to you, and hopefully it won't be too long before we can talk in person.
Yes, perfect. That would be great.